Well, hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 273rd New Social Environment. I'm Nick Bennett, the Special Projects Editor here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between Giuseppe Penone, Alexis Dahan, and Francesca Pietropaolo. We're also thrilled to have the poet Gabriele Tinti here, who will read to close today's program. We start all of our events here in our Zoom with two important acknowledgements. The first is that here in Brooklyn, we are on the unceded land and waters of Lenape-Hoking, which still belongs to the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. The second acknowledgement is that Black Lives Matter. We recognize the legacy of settler colonialism as a part of the many contemporary expressions of white supremacy. We honor those that have lost their lives to this violence, and I encourage all of you to check the chat for a living document of resources and actions as we all do our part in the learning and unlearning required to undo this legacy of injustice. And now to introduce today's guest and hosts. Born in Garessio, Italy in 1947, Giuseppe Penone is one of the most significant artists related to developments in sculpture in the 60s and 70s and to Arte Povera. Penone's work retains its own distinctive character, incorporating binary meanings related to the natural world and the notion of living sculpture. Penone's interest in the space between the hand and the touched surface that becomes sculpture and drawing, between imprint and sight, gesture, and action has been sustained throughout his body of work. He has exhibited extensively and internationally and recently received the McKim Medal in 2017 and the prestigious Praemium Imperiale International Arts Award for Sculpture in 2014. His exhibition at Marian Goodman in New York is on view through April 17, 2021. And for our hosts today, a French artist and writer living in New York, Alexis Dahan completed his master's degree in literature and philosophy in Paris and studied journalism at New York University. Dahan has exhibited his work in solo shows in the United States and Europe and is an alumni of the International Studio and Curatorial Program. Dahan is a regular contributor to Purple Magazine, with whom he has conducted and published interviews of artists such as Joseph Kosuth, Jeff Wall, Gabriel Orozco, Lawrence Weiner, Giuseppe Penone, Barbara Cougar, and Adrian Villar Rojas. An Italian-born art historian, curator, and critic based in Venice, Francesca Pietropaolo has held curatorial positions at the Walker Art Center, the Museum of Modern Art, the Fondazione La Biennale di Venezia, the Foundation Louis Vuitton, and has worked on exhibitions and site-specific commissions featuring artists such as Dieter Roth, Bryce Martin, Ellsworth Kelly, Adrian Villar Rojas, Danielle Beren, and among many others. In 2019, she co-curated the exhibition Artists Need to Create on the Same Scale That Society Has the Capacity to Destroy, Mare Nostrum, organized by the Brooklyn Rail, a collateral event of the 2019 Venice Biennale. She's also the author of Writings on Art, 1980 to 2005, the first anthology of writings by Robert Storr, among many other publications. Francesca has contributed to many international publications, and she is also an editor-at-large for the Brooklyn Rail. So without further ado, I hand the microphone over to you, Francesca and Alexis.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much, Nick, for this introduction. I would like to thank the Marian Goodman Gallery, the Friends of Brooklyn Rail for organizing this conversation, and thanks to Giuseppe for being here with us. We are so happy to have the chance to talk to him tonight, Alexis and I. I would like to start with the exhibition that is on at the Marian Goodman Gallery until the 17th of April. And here are on display canvases, sculptures, drawings. Here we go. We start seeing some pictures. And so there's a wide range of expression means. So here we have the room with the Leaves of Grass series. Let's move on to the next picture, just to have a general understanding of the exhibition that is on right now. The next, please. Here we see some paper works of 2014 entitled Leaves. So I would like to start talking with Giuseppe about this extraordinary series of pieces dating back to 2013. The title is Leaves of Grass. These are oil canvases, and each work has a terracotta piece, a little sculpture hanging. We can see one example here. And these works were inspired by a book, a poetry book, a very special book, because it was the first edition dating back to 1855 of Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman, that was printed and bound and set to type by the poet himself. If we can go back to the previous slide, please, with the detail of the surface of one of the canvases. I would like to start from here, Giuseppe, because something that struck me very much about these works of yours is that, well, from a distance, you have the impression to see landscapes, but on the contrary, from a close, you see the material just expanding. And if you look even closer, you see that the paintings are made of fingerprints that you deposited, and by accumulation, they create a sort of osmosis. So you have the body evocated by the fingerprints that is in osmosis with nature. If you were able to get even closer and zoom in even more, we could see that these fingerprints recall vegetal forms that remind ourselves of leaves. And there's a lot of material sensuality that is related to the tactile aspect of these works. And the fingerprints are also evident on the hanging terracotta sculpture. I really find a lot of sensuality. So I would like to ask you something about this, because this sensuality goes back also to the poetic language as an organic language in Whitman. So I remember his verses. So these always the procreant urge of the world, this urge. So Giuseppe, please tell us more about the origin of these works and the relationship that you have to this book, especially this one. Well, good morning and good evening, everybody. So I can start by saying that my biggest interest is sculpture, and sculpture is based on touch. Touch is something that is almost invisible, because when you touch something, somehow you hide the surface you're touching, you cover it. When we say cover, well, we always think about color, and the word color comes from covering in terms of etymology. So we cover a surface with the material that can be a hand touching or can be a color. However, the idea of sculpture I had in my mind since the very beginning was to try to reflect on the surface of things. So trying to explore the surface of things. And that means to be on the same level of the surface of things, so that there is no domination between one of the two elements in the relationships. On the contrary, my body and the material I'm touching are on equal terms. So this equality generates images. And so this image can be a fingerprint that is something animal, is a trace, is a mark, but it can also be another kind of trace or left or mark that is left. I mean, we spend so much time to clean those traces and marks in our society today, but instead that imprint can be turned into culture when you can identify the author of that trace and mark. In my very first works, I put a hand on a tree trunk because I wanted to make visible the imprint of a hand on a specific material. In the beginning, I thought about doing that with a fistful of clay, but then I thought that leaving a mark inside a living creature like a tree would have generated a different impact, leading to a different reflection. As we can see now on screen, you see that the imprint left on a fistful of clay is a primary image. It's one of the simplest images you can generate with the sculpture. And this simplicity, especially at the beginning of my work, was also related to a specific historic moment, because at that time, the values and the conventions of previous art were discussed. I'm talking about the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s. So there was a controversial debate about art, and I was not alone. I mean, almost all artists of that generation, I was maybe one of the youngest in the group, but still, we were all working on a new language. We wanted to develop a new language if possible, and we wanted to create new expression ways beyond the conventional expression ways that had been used up to that point. And I think that this also explains why sculpture was very present at that time, and artists used sculpture very much. Some artists started as painters, but then they shifted to sculpture because they wanted to somehow escape the conventions of painting. So there was this dynamic that was aimed at developing a new language to express ourselves. So this is some sort of background to describe these works that could be considered as painting, but also as sculpture, because this surface was touched. The image was not produced by the sight, but by the hands, by the touching of the hands. The result of this touch is then processed by the eyes, and that creates that general picture that you have and that remind you of a landscape or of leaves. Leaves of Grass is an incredible title. It is extraordinary because it evokes a relationship to nature, an osmotic relationship to nature in all senses. So it's the osmosis between man and nature, and also between man and man. So there's a very important idea of equality between and among all living creatures that is extraordinary. And in particular, my interest for Leaves of Grass is that the book itself is precious, because the book is like a pair of opening and closing hands, because a book stems from the hands, because it opens and closes as two hands. So I also collect books from other authors, but this one really intrigued me. So I think that there is a close connection between sculpture and books. In particular, this book attracted me because there's a special color on the cover. I was drawn to this color. And when you touch the cover of the book, little particles of the material of the cover sort of remain on your hands, and then those particles are spread around through the fingers, through the hands. So somehow the material of the book is disseminated around. So, I mean, the book is not just, intellectual material, but also tangible material. And so all of that somehow led me to generating these pieces. I did a lot of research on the color of the original cover of this first edition of Leaves of Grass, and then I had the opportunity to buy a couple of years later, to buy these original edition of Leaves of Grass. I was able to buy it a couple of years after I did the pieces. And so this book is still extremely inspiring to me. Sort of work on in different ways. The emotion is what counts the most. And it was not my intention to generate a landscape or something that was in line with the history of painting. The picture that was generated looks like a landscape, but actually the basic idea is that fingerprints have an oval shape, and that shape reminds me of leaves. So I thought about covering the whole canvas surface with my fingerprints, and these fingerprints look like leaves. And this is the very first time that I display these works. And these works are strictly related to Leaves of Grass, so the relationship is quite direct. On top of that, poetry is made of words, and words are a breath that goes into air. And this is carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is absorbed by leaves. So if you want, there is also a correlation between spoken words and the leaves making up a landscape. And also, I can tell you that my intention was somehow to touch a landscape, to touch with my fingers, with my hand, what you usually see in a landscape. Can we please go back to the picture of the first edition of Leaves of Grass? Thank you. So I would like to link up to what you were just saying, Giuseppe. And in this first edition, Whitman crafted the title in a very special way. Each letter turns into a vegetal form. It's amazing. So here we see this osmosis between the written word and each element and component composing it that goes back to the primary gesture of sculpture. So the fingerprint of your fingers that touch a surface. I would like to ask you a curiosity, and we talked about this during our preparatory chat for this conversation. So you are a collector of first editions, you told me, and is this because you like the idea of the first publication of a book? Or could you please tell us more about this passion of yours about first edition books? Well, I do think that emotions, intensity, desire, and expectations that are inside a poet when publishes their first book probably is the most important moment in their lives, because everything that has to do with their life and person are contained in that book. So I think that there's also a special connection between a poet and his very first book. So maybe this becomes less intense with further publications, but certainly the first edition of a first book usually contains incredible things. And the same happened to Leaves of Grass by Whitman, but also the same happened to Fervor de Buenos Aires by Borges, his very first book that has a very special story because he had to leave and he had just about published the books, and he put the book in the pockets of the coats in the cloakroom of a literature club. And then when he went back to Argentina, he found out that the members of that literature club loved his book. But there are other anecdotes. Gabriele D'Annunzio published his first book when he was 16. And in order to promote the book, he spread the news that the author of the book was dead. So each first edition is always related to some special stories. And this is just amazing, regardless then of the content or the artistic value of the book itself. There are some books like Pessoa's books that are very simple. Antino's is his very first book. It's a funeral elegy. And Antinous was the lover of Emperor Hadrian. And the graphics is extremely simple and essential and clean. So each first edition is special. And when it comes to the relationship between a book and a hand, it's very special because it's a relationship made of gestures, and that gesture reminds of sculpture.
There's an aspect of this book, the first edition of it, and also of the last edition as well, very suggestive. These books have the same title as the series. So it's almost like a tree that has developed. I wanted to know about one side of this book that's important for you. Could you talk about that?
So the series includes 6 works. Well, it includes 12 works. 6 are on display in New York, and another 6 will be displayed in Paris in the fall at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Can you tell us something about the dimensions that you chose to create these works? Because there is a relationship to the body, and not only as creator, but also for the viewer. And please tell us more also about, the relationship between the works and the poems in the book, because also the book contains 12 poems. So these are 12 canvases because the book includes 12 poems. And I enlarged the surface of the open book 7 times. So each canvas, the dimensions of each canvas are 7 times the surface of the open book. 7 is a special number that has a special meaning somehow in the Kabbalah. On top of that, 7 was the right number because I got the ideal dimension, 2 meters by 3. I don't remember the other question that you asked me, but actually, well, you already answered. So about the dimensions and the relationship between the number of the canvases and the content of the book. And I must say something else. Some of the canvases have a final result that is less related to the picture of a landscape. So some recall the waves of the sea and are more material centered. So the sensation they generate when you face them is different. It is less descriptive, let's say. So you pay a lot of attention to the concept of metamorphosis, of transformation, of change. It is also a constant topic in your body of work. Oh, yes, definitely. It is something that I started doing in '68 with my first works. Oh, I forgot one thing as to clay. So the clay sculptures that you see hanging on the canvases come from the United States. So it's earth from the United States. The first works I did back in the 60s were about a hand that I put on a tray. I thought that if I had enough time in my life to somehow retain in my hand the trunk of a small tree, probably that tree would have kept growing, but integrating my hand in it. So my hand would have become part of the tree, so would become part of the flow of the tree and become a part of its shape. So this idea of fluidity, of flow, is something that has always been with me since the very beginning. And this idea is the same idea that let me work on the sculpture in a new way. For instance, I carved the trunk of a tree following the lines of the rings. And so I was able to carve inside the trunk of a tree the shape of the developing tree when the tree was younger. So I did that in order to better investigate the possibilities of materials, in particular in terms of expression.
Nick, can we go back to the images of the show at Marian Goodman? That's it. This one. The next one. Next. That's it. This is it. So speaking of the process of these sculptures, I wanted to ask you if you could explain your process to us a little bit, how you create a work like this from beginning to end.
Yes, I carved a shape inside the trunk of a tree, and I did that by following the lines of the inner rings of the tree and cutting out the material accumulated by the tree over time. So I carved in the trunk following the growing rings of the tree, and so I just took away parts of the inner material of the trunk corresponding to a certain age. So somehow where the branches were, I started also carving inside the branches. When I saw what I got, so the idea was to create somehow the negative of a tree. So creating the negative of a tree that had existed, because of course I had to cut it and section it in order to be able to work on it and process it to get this negative. When I saw what I got as final outcome, I saw shapes that were extremely anthropomorphic, and it was a pine tree, and the branches looked like the breasts of a woman. And that shape, that form made me think of the branches as feeding elements of the rest of the tree. So that reminded me so much of the human body. And so I made a mold of the void part and I got a positive. And then I cast the positive. It's 170, 180 centimeters. And so it corresponds to, an anthropomorphic dimension. So somehow I tried to suggest a human body, and I called this piece Artemis, because Artemis was a goddess of the Greek mythology, and not only of the Greek mythology. So Artemis was a goddess related to fertility and procreation and life. So Giuseppe, here we can also see the memorial content of art, because this sculpture goes back to ancient goddesses, the goddesses of fertility, also back to the Paleolithics, but also Daphne of Ephesus in the 2nd century before Christ. Can you tell us something about this connection to traditional art somehow? And also your choice of material is special, because bronze and bronze casting is something that goes back to the natural world and the life of trees, a very ancient process. Oh yeah, I love working with materials. So the matter to me is extremely important. Today we have technological materials, and usually technological materials are used for human purposes, and well, they're also strictly related to economic interest. But when you work with stones and clay, so with materials that somehow deeply belong to nature, even man is part of nature, but these materials are not strictly related to human activities today. Well, when you work with those materials, you enter in a closer relation to material, and that relation has not changed over the centuries. So when you look at a leaf, at a sunset, at a stone, or at the dawn, well, somehow you experience the very same emotions that people that lived thousands of years ago experienced. So when you work a material, regardless of the intentions of the artist working with it, can inevitably relate to the past and to ancient times. In this case, well, Artemis is a clear connection. I could have called it differently, but I named it Artemis to underscore this relationship between us and people and cultures and civilizations that lived thousands of years ago.
So, Francesca, let's make an introduction of the show in Florence to continue.
Yes, please, Nick, the next slide. Giuseppe, I would like now to touch upon one of your most recent projects. This is a spruce, and so we moved from anthropomorphic shapes to different shapes. So this is a 20 meters high spruce standing in the beautiful Piazza della Signoria in Florence. It's made of metal, and it's in a public space that is full of history. And so this tree is surrounded by copies of the Judith by Donatello and the David by Michelangelo, and it was officially opened on March 25th for the day chosen by Italy to commemorate the 700th anniversary year of the Florentine poet's death. And so this tree is seen as a metaphor for Dante's Paradiso. I don't know, Alexis, would you like to ask a question about this? But it would be interesting to understand how you conceived this work and its installation in this square that is so full of history and I mean, full of references and full of people always crossing it. This work was made specifically upon commission and is related to an exhibition that I will have in June in Florence. It will be open beginning of June in Florence. So the director of the Uffizi Gallery shared his idea with me. He wanted on top of the exhibition to have a work installed in a public space in order to favor the interaction between the public and art. This is a work that I made in 2013 and that had no connection to Dante or to Dante's poetry. And when I made it, I wanted to work on the idea of growth and degrowth of a plant, of a tree, because this growth process follows a spiral, so a spire sort of process. So I put some bronze bamboo canes up to the trunk, and that somehow followed the shape and the spiral created by the tree trunk. I thought that this work could be connected to Dante's work because it has to do with the journey that Dante makes, because he travels from the hell to heaven. So it follows the same sort of movement from downwards upwards. And also in Dante's Divine Comedy, there's a part talking about a tree that is fed by a special nutritional element coming from heaven, from the sky. So this specific canto made me think about the tree, and some people corroborated this idea by referring to these verses. But actually, the exhibition that will open is entitled Alberi Inversi. That means tree in verses, but inverse can also mean inverted. And in particular, these exhibition will refer to a piece that is displayed inside the Uffizi Gallery. So this creates a bit of confusion.
I have a material question for you. It seems like the fir tree is a tree that's very special to you, more than the others. So I wanted to ask you, because it seems to me, so how do you choose one specific tree that's so important to your work? How do you choose the ideal tree for any given work of art?
The spruce is, I mean, like a tall stone, and a tall stone is a very ancient idea of sculpture, and all conifers have this kind of shape, and that's why I like using and working with on conifers and spruces. For instance, I carved a beam inside a tree, and it is also possible because spruce trees have very specific characteristics. If I were to do the same with an oak, I would get a different result because oaks have fewer branches. Spruces instead, and conifers in general, instead have more branches, so they are more suitable for my work. And in particular, this work had to be cut down, and branches were so regular. So I cut the branches in an alternate way to create the specific points where to fit in the bronze bamboo canes. And I had to work with steel alloy in order to have flexibility and lightness. So I could not use bronze for the trunk structure. Instead, I used steel that has specific features, the features I needed for this kind of shape and height, because this is for a public space, and I had to create something absolutely safe. And by the way, well, stainless steel is a modern material. Bronze instead is a very ancient material that has always been used for sculpture, and it goes back to the animistic vision of nature. The very first bronze casting were very special, and because it requires very special sort of technical work. So I think that somehow the relationship between vegetables and bronze is very old and ancient. And also bronze is a highly mimetic material. Think about Rodin sculptures and the Balzac sculpture made by Rodin. It looks like a vegetable shape. You do not see the human element any longer. So, I mean, I think that bronze perfectly integrates with nature. There was a Plutarchus dialogue, and is about some visitors visiting a temple devoted to Apollon in Delphi. And at one point, they end up discussing about the color of the sculptures, because bronze had turned into different shades because of the climate. So bronze is a living material because it changes color. It can change color. So it's very vital material. So yes, let's now move on to drawings, always talking about vitality. So this is a Thoughts and Sap. This is a piece made in 2015, so 2 years after the spruce sculpture. And here at the center, we see the sap flowing inside the tree. And one of the most interesting things, in my opinion, in this drawing is the dialogue between the image that is made of matter and the written text. The text is made of thoughts and notes that you wrote, and that relate to reality, but also have a poetic nature. Please tell us more about the role of writing in your drawings and also in your compositions, because somehow the written text becomes part and parcel of the work. Oh yes, in this case, the writing follows specific lines because you see that the words somehow wrap the central part, the central core. So to me, the core at the center is a tree, and so the words all around work like the growth rings of a tree. That's why they expand all around the tree trunk. And this very same idea is present also in another work called Propagations, but maybe we can talk about that later on. Well, going back to writing, I use it to write down ideas. Sometimes I integrate written words also to remember the mental process that led to that specific idea, to that specific drawing, or also I write down just to clear my own ideas, because sometimes maybe the intention I have in my mind is a bit blurred, and through the writing, I can understand my own ideas better. I can decipher them better. Oh yeah, well, if you read what you write, so the sentences seem to create a sort of continuous and seamless flow. And especially the handwriting is so close to drawing and to one person's identity. So certainly there is a direct relation to matter, to identity. And sometimes the writing also becomes almost incomprehensible and impossible to decipher.
Let's continue speaking about drawings. And let's take a look at the other images of drawings. After this. Okay, that's it. Drawing is such an important part of your work. So I wanted to ask you if in this very technological world, there's a space between drawing and technology. You know, there's really just this sheet of paper and a pencil. It's so simple. So I want to ask you specifically about the relationship between the development of technology and your own work, and if you feel the effect.
As I said before, technology is a product of man, is an expression possibility, is also material, but is something that is made by man. Instead, a piece of coal is something different, and you can express yourself with a charcoal, and with the charcoal crayon, you can create something incredible, much more incredible than something created with a computer, for instance. So I like always to stick to reality beyond conventions. If, for instance, I always make a difference between a drawing made from real, so trying to reproduce reality, and a drawing based on a photograph. And when you look at something from real and you try to reproduce that in a drawing, your eye and your sight makes a selection and chooses what to reproduce. And that selection and that choice is made according to your own sensitivity. A photograph instead is something more objective. It's something that somehow is more equal because it perfectly represents and depicts all the things that are portrayed in a very equal way. So this selection our eyes make when we try to reproduce a real landscape or something real in a drawing goes through a sort of reality processing gesture that is based on our own sensitivity. And this is so precious and essential. This is what we should preserve in art, regardless of economic interest, regardless of the extraordinary possibilities offered to us by technological means like the one we're using now. But look at this drawing made by Leonardo to represent the air movements, and were used by him then to create the Battaglia di Anghiari. And it's incredible. It's still an incredible drawing. And even if this is a reproduction of a reproduction of a reproduction, you can still perceive the invention, the power of creation of man with respect to a machine. A machine could have never, ever made such an essential shape and image. And this essentiality related to our own way to capture and process reality through our own eyes and minds and sensitivity. It is the most interesting possibility we have. But Giuseppe, before opening the floor to questions, can we have a look, Nick, to the next slide? And we would like to ask you about this idea of propagation. This is an idea that you have explored many times. Here we see two pictures, and one evokes the tree growth rings, and the other one instead is a propagation of the lines of a fingerprint of yours. So we go back to the touching and the surface touching we started with by talking about leaves of grass. So could you tell us more about this work? And next, please. So we can see from this detail how this paperwork was originated. Yeah. Yes, this piece stems from the idea that, well, our fingertips already contain the idea of the world surrounding us. And so what I did is very simple. I started creating circles starting from my fingerprint, and then I propagated those rings. So the basic idea, as I said in the very beginning of our conversation, was to enhance the incredible number of fingerprints that we leave all through our life. And so we are tactile beings, and we occupy space through touching. We touch so many things. So I developed this idea of touching being so important in our lives by propagating the lines stemming from the fingerprint. And so I kept the very same structure of the fingerprint, and I followed the propagation process of the rings of a tree, but also the rings generated on a water surface, but also the sound follows the same propagation pattern when it moves in space. So again, a fingerprint that is so small is something that can become very big and can invade space, can become enormous, gigantic, and just spread around in space.
So we can stop here if you like. We can ask Nick if we have some time to take questions from the public.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe. Thank you. Thank you.
Grazie, Giuseppe, Francesca, Alexis, and as well Susanna and Christian. We do have quite a few questions from the audience. I'm going to hand the mic over to those that posted them in the chat. So first, just one moment. First, we're going to go to Igor. Igor, I'm going to hand the mic to you. Can you hear us, Igor?
Much before its time, and it was really
I must confess that I do not master English, so it's hard for me to fully understand his poetry and the content of his verses and his way of writing. So my relation to Whitman is more to the material of his book, and so to the book that he physically crafted to publish his poetry book. Well, what you say is extremely interesting and true, because also the image that Whitman conveyed is about him as a carpenter, as a man of doing, not as a man of literature. So he portrayed himself as a man close to things, to materials, and so these find echoes in the poetry of other authors when he talks about the birds and nature, when he describes a bird that lost its companion. So he identifies himself with nature very, very much. And then he also talks about history and historical topics and geography. So he enters so many worlds and he explores so many topics that go far beyond his seminal intuitions. But I think that his seminal work somehow is very important to determine the rest of his work and body of work. But I'm not a Whitman expert when it comes to his poetry, so I'm not competent at all. I mean, my relation to Whitman is strictly related to the title of this book and the material nature, the physicality of this book.
Grazie, Giuseppe. Our next question is going to come from Louis Couture. Louis, you should be able to turn your mic on now.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for the interesting discussion. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My question was about the phrase finger painting in English has a very specific connotation to painting done by children, very young children. And I wonder if it has the same connotation in Italian, and also if Mr. Penone has any particular association to that as a technique.
Excuse me, could you please repeat your question? What did you refer to? Sorry.
Finger painting.
Oh, sorry, finger.
Yeah. Do we have this word in Italian, and do we think of it as something which especially small children do? And how does Mr. Penone think of it?
Well, we say the same in Italian. So
Okay.
fingerprinting and finger painting, there's no specific term. Certainly, children understand and apprehend reality with hands and touch long before than with your eyes. So because the sight somehow goes through an abstraction process. So the tactile contact with reality is the very first contact children have with reality and the world. So thanks to this tactile relationship, they can make up their own vision of reality. And so they discover the world through touching, and they can then sort of explore the relationship between their body and their surrounding world. And this is probably one of the most important and basic values of sculpture itself.
Grazie. Our next question is going to come from just a moment, from HV Mahoney. Let me turn on HV. You should be able to turn on your microphone now.
Good evening. I live in San Francisco, and I wanted to hear more about the sculpture of yours that is at Fort Mason in San Francisco right now. I wanted to know more about your feelings about the place where you put it, and I wanted to know about your whole feeling about the location.
The sculpture in Fort Mason, well, relates to an exhibition that I made at the Gagosian Gallery. And after that, I had the opportunity to install some works in Fort Mason, but I think they have been taken away because the installation was due to end in September last year. I think they are not there any longer, but still, that place was chosen for specific reasons. Well, first of all, because it was available, and secondly, I had a great opportunity because it's a place that is very loved by people and is attended by many people, and it's attended by people that are not, art specialists. So I put a horizontal piece and a vertical piece, and so I wanted to explore the interaction with the audience that usually goes to this green area. And I installed two works, a vertical one featuring a tree with some stones on it, and some stones are also on the ground. And so these stones on the ground can become a resting point, maybe to have some rest during a stroll. And the stones on the tree, so on the branches, are there where the bifurcations of the branches are, to underscore the very strong tree structure, because every tree has to sustain and support such a huge weight, because the branches and the leaves make up such a big weight. And you can see it especially when there's wind or there is snow on them. The other horizontal piece is a work that depicts a fallen tree trunk with some branches, and at the end of the branches on the ground, there are real growing trees. So this is a sort of a small grove of trees, 5 little trees that have been laid out according to the branch structure. So the logic is not the geometrical logic applied by man that plant trees at a distance of 5-4 meters. Instead, the trees are located according to the position of the branches. So they follow nature and its pattern, and not man's pattern.
Grazie, Giuseppe and HV. Next, we will be going over to Cameron. Cameron Kerr, you should be able to turn on your mic.
Oh, hello from Vancouver. Thank you for the talk. I'm a big fan of your work. I have 2 questions. You can choose which one you'd like. I was wondering how you see your work relating to the visual cortex, the eye retina, and how the fingerprint paintings relate to the visual cortex, the architecture of the brain, and the structure of the unconscious. And the second question is how you see the relation of the growth rings of the tree correlating to psychology, philosophical content, and maybe the removal of the ego and creative thought. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, I heard you.
Oh,
Well, ego removal is a big issue because ego is strictly related to survival and is part of the preservation instinct of man and of the human species. Trees represent nature. Historically, trees are nature to us, and we always forget that men do also belong to nature. Over the years, we realize that the survival need of man is strictly related to the survival of what we call nature and everything existing on the planet. And because of this, we are on equal terms with the other creatures. So our individual value actually equals the value of a stone. Well, a stone lasts much longer. We just lost a couple of dozens of years. So this equality between our presence, our life, and the life of all the other creatures and beings, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about life and survival, because even a stone is alive, the cosmos is alive. Well, this issue is something that we need to fully understand in order to survive as a species. So our vision of the world is extremely selfish in some ways. Well, I'm not condemning that. I think that it is legitimate for men to desire to survive, but this equality between men and other forms of life is something that goes back to ancient times. Well, animism, let's talk about animism. Well, according to animism, some elements of the world contain life. So animism is extremely respectful of any form of life. So somehow any killing of animals, for instance, should be somehow compensated. So this sort of vision of equality between man and nature is very ancient. I don't know if I answered your question. I don't know, maybe your intention was different when you asked me what you asked me.
No, it's good. Thank you.
Thank you both. Our final question of the day comes from the Rail's very own Fong H. Bowie. Fong, you can turn on your mic now.
Grazie mille, Giuseppe. Grazie mille, Francesca, anche Alexis. So I was thinking, just because of this new body of works is so new for you, I can't help to think of landscape, in the sense that, you know, when we think of landscape, true landscape didn't really appear until the 1st century BC in Roman art. We forgot that Roman as a civic environment was so densely populated that the wealthy homeowner would commission a fresco, and many of whom were painted without any kind of specific locales, but it's really create out of the imagination, so that nearly almost we can even refer them as sacred and idyllic landscape, because have that connotation, so that you can escape from the annoyances of the Roman life. I mean, Pompeii was definitely for the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. But I'm thinking of this particularly now, Giuseppe, because it's two things occur to me immediately. One is a great Dutch painter, but mostly known for his printmaking, whose work Rembrandt admired greatly and collected even. In fact, there's a painting in the Uffizi that belonged to Rembrandt at one point. It's a mountain landscape that he painted over of Hercules Sagers is his name, Hercules Sagers, and it's in Uffizi. And the reason why I'm thinking about Sager particularly because he always trying to, in his work, evoke a sense of deep melancholy. And it refers so much to Chinese landscape painting because there's no presence of man. It's just completely solely focused on the grandeur of nature where there's no hierarchy. There's no perspectival depth, illusionism and whatnot. But I'm thinking about Sager particularly because there's a sense of density, there's a sense of skeletal, and your work have always, at least to me, there's an incredible subtle sense between growth and where it lies between ruin and decay, as much as it is internal of form and the external of form. So to make the long question a little bit more simple, I don't know whether you're thinking about Chinese landscape painting, Giuseppe, or even Hercules Sagers. I have another one coming, but let's just focus on this one first.
Well, I don't know that well Chinese landscape painting, but I'm thinking about also the Japanese landscape painting that maybe has the same spirit, and this spirit can be found in Leonardo da Vinci when he analyzes and studies nature. He studies nature almost with the scientific purposes in some cases. Chinese painting, in my opinion, develops a different idea, an idea of meditation, but still what you said about man, that is just a small element in nature among many others, can be found in a Flemish artist. In Bruegel, the elderly, we find landscapes with very small, teeny-weeny figures. So actually the history of man is accompanied by landscapes with small human figures that are somehow scattered in the landscape, because then man turns into dust, into clay, into earth, and disappears. And the clay that I put on my works, I don't dare to call them paintings, well, is a handful, is a fistful of memory of man, of a specific place from which that earth comes from. So it's a vegetal, mineral, and human memory at the same time. So earth has this incredible, extraordinary, multifaceted value, or at least to me as artist when I touch it. And earth is also part of landscape, is an element that somehow contains all the other elements. And maybe this is a connecting point between many visions and ideas that we can develop on landscape. In the 20th century, so landscape was not very popular as a topic for painters. The last ones were maybe the Impressionists, but then there was Cézanne, who painted nothing but landscapes, but his landscapes are so sensual and so emotion provoking that really unfolds a real sense of sensuality. So it's not just about nature. Well, at the end of the day, man projects his own image over things, his own emotions over things. And we find this again and again. From the paintings of 30,000 years ago in Ardèche, we have the Chauvet caves in France. I had a great chance to visit those caves, and there are 400 different types of animals carved on the walls of the caves, and those primitive animals still stir in us so many emotions. Those emotions have never changed. That is the very kind of emotion that art can generate in people. Writing is different. You need to decipher the writing. Instead, painting, art is something that is so long lasting over the centuries, and it is extraordinary. And that's why we can keep in dialogue even with people that lived 30,000, 40,000 years ago. This is extraordinary for art. And I think that all the people that work to keep these language of expression alive are more than welcome. So even your publication, even the Brooklyn Rail, represent an effort to keep art alive, and is something extremely important and precious. So really, it's fantastic.
In solidità, Giuseppe. Yes, I couldn't agree with you more when you mentioned Bruegel. To me, he's probably the first Western artist whose worldview is very identical to Eastern artists. Definitely, for sure. You're absolutely right about that, Giuseppe. And in regard to Cézanne, it was unfortunate when John Elderfield, who have worked on this remarkable show, it was supposed to be at the Princeton Art Museum, and it's focused on his ecological relationship to the sites that he painted it. You know, it was called Quarries and Rocks. It's so interesting because we know so much how much Cézanne hated the technology. He often complained about the soap factory was being built right by his house or the landscape that he painted. Okay, so that's one way of thinking about landscape and whatnot. But I'm thinking about now, since my friend Luigi Barrarini came by last night and gave me this luminous book. It's an anthology of Italian poetry dating from 1956 to 75. There's another volume. It's almost big as my torso here. But because of the first translation, we know, Giuseppe, of Leaf of Grass, it's been translated, I believe, in the late 1880s by a very famous Italian poet and translator. His name is Luigi Gamberale. And it was not until, I believe, later that that it became more known. And Giovanni Pavnini thought he was the precursor of Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, or even Nietzsche and all that. My point is that there's a long association that have lived very, very well in Italian poetry until the rise of Mussolini. Whitman did not become as well known, but I think he's coming back. My last question is that how can you describe your relation to the poetic tradition in Italian? Have you had any deep conversation with fellow poets that you have came across in your friendship with them? And how does that relate to your own work, Giuseppe?
Well, I like reading poetry because it requires a mental process that is very similar to the one that you somehow develop when you create a piece. It's a process of synthesis. You evoke so many images and emotions and sensations, but then you have to distill them in something. And this is the same process that I face when I create something. So this is the aspect of poetry that I like the most, but this is not the only one. I also like something else. When you go to a bookshop, usually you see dozens and dozens of shelves full of tourist books, travel books, and then maybe there is a section about, I don't know, light reading, and then you have more serious literature, and then little by little you find essays, and then the shelves become smaller, narrower, and then you find a very small section devoted to poetry. And poems somehow contain all the other words used in all the other books, but there are so few and so limited in space in a bookshop. So there's limited number of books that contains so much, all the rest of the bookshop somehow.
I mean, no more question, just gonna be, have to think and process what you just had to say there. Yikes. Grazie mille, Giuseppe. Grazie mille.
Thank you very much indeed, Giuseppe.
Grazie, Giuseppe, Fong, everyone. Thank you so much to everyone in the audience that shared questions. Apologies, we couldn't take them all, but I just want to thank Giuseppe, Francesca, Alexis for today's conversation. And again, thank you so much to Susanna, Christian, and Marco for making this translation possible. Also, a special thanks to everyone over at Marian Goodman for their help to make today's event possible. Here at the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading, and I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Gabriele Tinti, to the stage. A recent recipient of the 2018 Montale Poetry Award, Gabriele is an Italian poet and writer. He has worked with the J. Paul Getty Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the British Museum, the National Roman Museum, the Archaeological Museum in Naples, among many others, composing poems for ancient works of art, including The Boxer at Rest, the Arundel Head, the Ludovici Gall, the Victorious Youth, the Farnese Hercules, among many, many others. Please check the chat for some links to some of Gabriele's work. And without further ado, Gabriele, the floor is yours.
Grazie, Nick.
All right, pathos. You've got a lump in your throat, haven't you? The earth will come to laugh and to feast. Be honest, and you will not be able to hide the body. Every part of you knows the horror you have. There's no more to invent. Let that truth cover you and the leaves do their work. Believe me, it's useless still looking for springs. In the silence, slowly, hope will leave you be. Speaking of grass and vegetables. Toenail. The gangrene from the toenail climbs your soft body. The days undo all you have built. Night overturns everything on earth. Only a part is left to be photographed. Judgment Day. The day of judgment will come, he says, leaning out from the fresco. Everything will be smashed. The sun will mercilessly scorch. The plants will spew pitch. The chasm will finally be sated and the corpses will rush to be pardoned. All right. I will sleep as I once did. I will sleep as I once did in the hot breath of the hemorrhage. I will dream of the immense shadow of an ancient stone falling. I will cling to the heap of dust. I will not want to waken. Fragments. The morning is at an end. The throat is throttled on a last meal. It has thrown up and stopped the breath. You looked where you shouldn't have. You mistreated dreams, burnt every space. Your feet are cold. They remain only to compose the scene. Speak to me again, you beg me, but my heart shines in the shadow. My mouth is lead and heavy in its empty shelter, singing in silence. Again, the grass will grow from my breast. I will decay there with you, shrivel up, defining fate. I will chew what remains with my mouth full. The grass will grow from my breast. It will plaster my hair. Let me drown in the noise of my ancestors. Don't leave my body to the dogs. Don't leave my body to the dogs. Burn it far away with its ills. The fire will cleanse its wounds. The ashes will soothe its challenges. At 1,000 degrees, my bite will still be strong. My sin, this comedy. Scratch the grave where they have enclosed you. Engrave the walls with your fingernails. Try to escape. Move the air with your hand. Lick your wounds. Check your teeth, worn by the time spent clenching them to protect you from yourself, from the promises. In the middle, culter sinistorsum, culter dextrorsum, and us in the middle with so little to say. That's it. Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Grazie, Gabriele. Thank you for those beautiful and so fitting poems for today's conversation. I just once more want to thank everyone for joining today. Thank you so much, Giuseppe, for joining us, and Francesca and Alexis, and everyone for tuning in. The Rail is celebrating its 20th anniversary as a nonprofit dedicated to providing free and accessible criticism and community events. So if you enjoyed today's event, please consider making a donation to keeping the Rail and our special projects free, relevant, and independent. And if you're in New York, please make sure to see Giuseppe's show at Marian Goodman. That is on view until a few more weeks from now. So we'll post a link in the chat so you know exactly how much time you have. We're here every day at 1 p.m. So join us on Monday for a conversation between artist Ellen Altfest and Rail editor-at-large Toby Camps. We'll conclude with a poetry reading from Frank X. Walker. You all can now turn on your mics to say hello or goodbye, and I wish you all a great weekend.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Ciao, grazie.
Grazie mille.
Ciao, obrigada.
Beautiful.
Grazie a tutti.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you, Francesca, Giuseppe.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Ciao, Charlie. Ciao, Fang.
Now.
Thanks, Linda.
He was
Thank you so
interview.
much.
That was wonderful. Thank
That
you.
was.
Bye-bye.
Grazie,
Thank you,
everyone.
Linda. E grazie,
Thank you,
Giuseppe.
Ciao.
Giuseppe.
Francesca.
Well, they added up with other people. All right. Ciao.
I don't want to leave you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susanna. Thank you,
Thank
Marco.
you, Nick. Thank you, Giuseppe.